I wish to stop.
1919 was a crazy year for the United States. It wasn't only just because the Treaty of Versailles was signed, ending arguably one of the most deadliest conflicts in centuries, but America was also in a delusion that communism was surrounding them was going to destroy their way of life. This was a crazy year for the US. But why was this the case? Why did America fear communist revolution was on its way? Today we will look at the first Red Scare in the United States, but first we actually have to look at Russia, to understand this. Russia was governed by czars for exactly 370 years. The problem with Russia's monarchy is that they refused to modernize the country. By the 19th century, Russia was falling behind the great powers, who were modernizing and giving people rights. Russians were sick of the monarchy and opposition groups popped up. One of those was called the Bolsheviks. The party was led by Vladimir Lenin. He had read the great works of Karl Marx, and he wanted to overthrow the Russian monarchy and establish a communist state. But wait, what is communism? Communism is a political ideology where you live in a classless society. Businesses are all owned by the government, and distribution based on needs. Karl Marx said land should be owned publicly and not privately. In practice, communist states often became authoritarian, with centralized economies, powerful governments, ruling elites, and limited freedoms. Vladimir Lenin said in a capitalist system, the landowners and wealthy individuals would team up to systematically oppress the workers and poor farmers. The powerful capitalist nations relied on exploitation of the resources from underdeveloped nations to sustain their way of life, and thus the only way to end imperialism, and the colonialism that came with it, is to end capitalism itself. There was a failed revolution in Russia in 1905, then the February Revolution was a success. It led to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II. But this wasn't the last revolution because the new democratic government wasn't fixing anything. The people were still starving, and they were still at war with the Central Powers. This began the peace, land, and bread. It was a rallying cry used by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks during the 1917 Russian Revolution to quickly address the urgent demands of an exhausted, starving, and agrarian society. Then we have the final revolution led by the Bolsheviks, the October Revolution. On the night of October 25th the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace. The Battalion of Death did put up a fight, but it wasn't enough. And so they had to get in. It was time to destroy the old, and bring in the new. Vladimir Lenin had finally taken control of Russia. This was extremely oversimplified, and I will soon do two parts on the Russian Revolution. One for the stuff that leads up to the one of 1905, and then part 2 will be on the February and October Revolution. So what does this have to do with America? Surely nothing, right? Wrong. One major thing was that communism is an economic system in which there are no private ownerships of businesses or property. Because the average American takes pride in the personal ownership of homes and businesses, communism was viewed as a threat to the American way of life. But wait, there's more. Working conditions were absolutely terrible and may begin to protest as a result. Before modern labor laws and workers' rights, working conditions were defined by grueling 12 to 16-hour shifts, rampant exploitation, and severe physical hazards. Accidents were common with people losing limbs and being fired, with no compensation for it. This resulted in legislation which improved conditions for workers, but this so-called progressive era came to an end with the coming of the Great War. To increase war production labor, the government agreed to halt strikes. The government promised to maintain protections for workers, but this agreement between the AFL and the government came to an end once the war was over. This meant American workers in 1919 were facing some serious difficulties: the loss of government support, a wave of inflation and a rise in unemployment. 4 million demobilized soldiers and 9 million former war industry workers were now looking for work. The unions were calling for better wages and working conditions. Industrial and employers would oppose them, especially on topics like collective bargaining. This conflict caused around 3,600 strikes across the country that year. This rise in labor unrest stoked fears among some that organized labor was or could become a vehicle for Bolsheviks to carry out a revolution in the United States. But this perception was strengthened by the involvement in some strikes of more radical labor groups, like the Industrial Workers of the World, and the Socialist Party. In January, Seattle was rocked when over 35,000 shipyard workers struck for better wages and working hours. This soon turned into a general strike in the city. Now, despite the fact that the leaders of the strike, there of course were some radicals among them, one of said 95% of them agreed that the workers controlled industry. Nearly all of us agree on that, but very strenuous disagree on the method. Some think through political action, while others think through the cooperative movement. The press ran wild with stories of Bolshevik plots amongst the unions. The strike was non-violent, but still the media portrayed it as a Bolshevik attack with headlines like, "Reds directing Seattle strike, to test chance for revolution," or "Belief grows that strike is start of Bolshevik revolt." Seattle's Mayor Ole Hansen swore in an extra 1,000 police officers, and personally led 800 federal troops into the city in his American flag-draped car. He gave the order to the new officers to kill on sight anyone attempting to break the law or start a riot. Afterwards Hansen toured the country the rest of the year. He gave speeches of the imminent dangerous revolution that was going to happen. He said the so-called sympathetic Seattle strike was an attempted revolution, that there was no violence does not alter the fact. The intention was the overthrow of the industrial system. Fearing that official and public hostility might damage the cause of labor across the country, the AFL forced the strikers to back down. In February, a Senate committee originally formed to investigate German wartime propaganda was repurposed for an investigation of Bolshevism in Oliver anti-American radicalism in the United States. It also inquired concerning any party exercising or claiming to exercise authority in Russia. In March, they claimed the Socialist Party of America, the IWW, and the Bolsheviks were working together to stage a revolution in America, as evidenced by all three groups' history of using a red flag. They also feared up to 80,000 unions were vulnerable to Bolshevik propaganda. They thought they needed more restrictive laws of radicals, and a continued military pressure in Russia's civil war. Yes, America, along with other Allied powers, most notably countries like Britain and Japan, getting involved. Between 1918 and 1920, the United States deployed over 13,000 troops to northern Russia and Siberia during the Russian Civil War. These forces aimed to protect Allied military supplies, rescue the trapped Czechoslovak Legion, and counter the rising Bolshevik threat. However, the intervention faced brutal Arctic conditions and domestic opposition, ultimately ending in a total withdrawal after minimal strategic success and over 200 American casualties. Some Americans felt that the recent influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe, where communist and anarchist philosophies were prevalent, only increased the likelihood of such an event. An anarchist is someone who believes that there should be no government. In 1919, it appeared that many of these fears would be proven correct. A plot was uncovered in which 36 bombs were mailed out to important political figures, as well as prominent businessmen. USA Attorney General Alexander Palmer, and Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. were both targeted. John D. Rockefeller and J. P. Morgan Jr. were also threatened. On June 2, 1919, 8 more bombs exploded simultaneously in different cities across the country. Following these two incidents, the USA Justice Department launched a series of raids that came to be known as the Palmer Raids. This was an attempt to arrest and deport communists and anarchists who were seen as potentially dangerous. More than 500 foreign-born citizens were eventually deported. This panic over a communist threat became known as a Red Scare. The term is derived from a popular nickname, Reds, which was used to identify communists. Several other perceived threats emerged in the 1920s. In April of 1920, 2 men were murdered during an armed robbery at a shoe factory in Braintree, Massachusetts. 2 anarchists were blamed for the crime. Nicholas Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti both believed in a form of anarchism that promoted violent warfare against oppressive governments. They were placed on trial for the crime of murder, and were eventually found guilty and sentenced to death. There was much controversy and doubt as to whether these 2 men actually committed the crime, but the frightened public was searching for a scapegoat to blame. Their sentences of execution were carried out on August 23, 1927. On the heels of this incident, a rumor began circulating that a major uprising would occur on May 1, 1920, but this never happened. However, on September 16, 1920, a bomb exploded on Wall Street. 38 people lost their lives, and more than 140 were injured. Communists and anarchists were immediately seen as potential suspects. Many were brought in and questioned, but ultimately, no arrests were made. It would eventually die down, and the first Red Scare would come to an end. The United States and Union of Soviet Social Republics would eventually somewhat improve relations in 1921, and they would be very strengthened in 1941, when the USSR became one of the main 3 Allied powers. After the war, America and the Soviet Union were the 2 main powers that could project their influence across the world. The Soviet Union had liberated and put in place pro-Soviet communist governments in Eastern Europe. This of course created the Iron Curtain. Eventually this evolved into the Cold War, but during the Cold War, there would be yet another Red Scare, which I probably will do a video on. If you like the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Bye.